It's been very exciting testing out new things on the PTR. As we've discussed, the game of Overwatch plays quite different than what you're used to. It's been an absolute joy to tune into the EU Pro pugs that have been happening the last few days, with a full lobby filled with Tier 2 and even some Tier 1 pros trying out all the new changes. Now, we're going to take the spectator point of view for today's video, and the handsome man you see in the lower left corner is GosuPeak, former coach of the Dallas Fuel, as well as streamer, content creator. He's been spectating all of these pugs as well. It's a good place to go see multiple perspectives and get a sense of the overall macro game going on. Peak's links to his Twitch and his YouTube will be in the description, and around when this video goes live, I should be guesting on his stream to come talk about Overwatch 2 and other things as well, so you can come say hi live to that if you're viewing the video right when it goes up. Otherwise, check out his YouTube for it to be released there. Now, there's a few disclaimers I want to bring up about these pro pugs. These are mostly played to test and just to have fun on a new patch while the current ranked one is quite poor. So because of that, this won't give us a very accurate description of what the top meta comp will be. Maybe clues, but point being, there's a lot of picks being made for the fun of the gameplay rather than just trying to win, because there's nothing on the line, right? It's just a pickup game. But we can also see some general trends of what seems strong and what interactions are at play with the new balance patch of the game. And really, in the ranked environment, we don't always get the perfect comp anyway, so I actually think this is quite good to translate what a good ranked experience might feel like. What I'm going to focus on is talk about some of the general principles we've been observing, what seems to be working together and what might be underrated, overrated, and just in general how the game's playing. So the first thing we have to draw attention to is that there is a new double barrier comp that is seeing a lot of popularity, and that is the duo of Orisa and Reinhardt, which your knee-jerk reaction might say those shouldn't go together, but remember, Orisa's now been reworked to be a brawler tank, so she plays in a similar position to Rein. Their relationship is kind of interesting because normally you would think the best pairing tank is Zarya, and the two of them when working together, in my opinion, makes Zarya the star, and Reinhardt tries to bully to make space to gain her charge and get her damage angles. Remember, Zarya got an alt fire buff as well, so her damage, especially AoE damage, is way more significant than Orisa's. But the crazy thing that Orisa and Reinhardt can do is combine two things. Because Steadfast is so good, Rein takes what he wants. Only Mayfreeze and Orisa Halt really stop him in his tracks. Any other crowd control, Rein brushes off, and it basically does nothing. So because of this, you have a big hulking German man pressuring towards you to run you over, and if you combine that with Halt that forces your movement to clump together, fire strikes and hammer swings and cleave and brawl get stronger from Reinhardt. So whereas when Zarya and Rein are together, Zarya is kind of the damage star. When Orisa is supporting Rein, he's the damage star, getting big value out of swings, fire strikes, and then setting up for big Earth Shatter combos. Also as well, the two of them have probably the most robust barriers now, at least to play around on the ground. But I'll stress, this comp has severe weaknesses from what we can tell. But I already thought that was the case with Sigma Orisa, but what ended up happening was there was knock-on effects of the super powerful DPS category with Doomfist, Mei, and Reaper, where you simply can't play some of the tanks that would have beat Sigma Orisa, and they sort of defaulted to being the best last patch. That same kind of default tank duo may crop up eventually with enough testing, and I'd say it probably hinges around which DPS get utilized, and sorry, it might still be Mei Reaper, but we'll get into talking about that a bit later. The other major team comp that seemed to do quite well is dive-oriented tanks. There's a few ways you can go about this, but it's centered around a pretty interesting principle about how Winston's barrier functions as a tank. Now, if you've played Overwatch for a few years, or remember him from the dive era, the principles that you would use to define Winston's tanking capability would be he has a very weak barrier, but high mobility, which means he could dive in, focus a target, and he was very aggressive, but didn't provide a lot of protection. Well, now, with all of the other barriers getting weaker, and damage being as strong as it is, but there is no static barrier really that does much. You could say Rein has the best because it has the most hit points, but Rein is so easily navigated around, or his shield kind of easily gets poked down as well. Because of that, as well as how mobile Winston is to be able to put his barrier where he wants, the opportunity of that, I think projected barrier from Winston is actually the strongest barrier. Now, obviously, it's not strong in the sense that you can just stand behind it and survive. It's strong because he creates a little sub-engagement that allows his teammates to flood into that space and shield dance around it and burst something down quickly. Now, keep that in your mind because Winston gets used in a couple different ways right now. The most obvious of which would be with Wrecking Ball, which was his best pairing in terms of aggressive dive, with a good bubble and the double melee of the pile driver and jump pack hitting at once. There's a lot of damage to come through. And there's some instances where you'd want to play D.Va as well. We'll get to that. But in my opinion, the low-key biggest buff to this playstyle is that Moira has been nerfed. In the past, when Moira healed 80 health per second with her primary heal, if Winston would dive on a target and cleave on multiple enemies, Moira's healing was so much that Winston was basically doing nothing and just charging Coalescence up faster. That type of damage was worthless, and because of that, you needed some big spike of damage like from Sigma, who could combo Accretion into Hyperspheres to delete one target very specifically, whereas the pressure damage of poking something down for 3 to 4 seconds with Winston just got hard countered by the healing that existed. Remember, it's not just barriers that got weaker overall. The way healing works is quite significantly different now too, and that allows Winston to roam around and pressure things down and manipulate the team fight like he used to, with also the added benefit of his barrier being, I think, probably the strongest. So to some degree, there is this effect where if Winston plays well, you cannot save the thing that he's fighting. This is how it felt when Mercy was the best healer. Winston's focus fire damage equaled out her healing, and the way the math and teamwork of that works, that means your other teammate is the one who actually does the damage, and Winston sort of negates healing, which allows you to focus down things that the enemy healers are trying to save. You also can obviously attack the healers too, but when you're Moira and can dodge everything, you can't simply always do that. And you don't want your tank to do functionally nothing in most of the fights if he can't get to the perfect position. So because of all this surrounding Winston, he both looks strong when dive isn't getting hard countered, as we'll talk about later, but also gets used a bit on defense with an Orisa. And that might sound kind of funny because it's like, well, Orisa doesn't have a bunker style and she has no mobility. But just like Orisa pairs with Rein, you can get a sort of double barrier meta team comp going with this as well. But the way this comp plays is the Winston looks to counter engage and you sort of set up two fronts. Sure, Orisa's barrier is much weaker, but that just means you don't put your entire team behind it. Having a barrier at all still allows for a free window of damage and a lane to be created for your damage characters. I mean, even in Overwatch League, we saw Brigida's personal shield get used to cover a Widow in a Widow duel, right? So even having a weak Orisa barrier, having it set up anywhere is still a major advantage on an off angle or playing from point. And then maybe you have sort of like the Enforcer playstyle that I used to say, kind of Winston takes on that role. And honestly, we've seen Winston get used in this off-tank style, even in the Overwatch League. In a few niche cases, I don't think I've ever covered it, but this isn't new to him entirely to have more of a, maybe you would say, off-tank pincer attack playstyle, and it all hinges around punishing the enemy's movements, which is easier to do on defense because you already have the ground to launch from. I don't think you'd want to play Winston Orisa on attack so much, but when you're already set up, it does look pretty viable. Keep in mind, Halt is just so good of an ability that it pairs with literally anything in the game. We've seen eras where Orisa's Halt has been weak, but it's only been when either all of the meta heroes are mobility. So for example, when Tracer was meta and the best hero in the game, what's a Halt going to do to a Tracer? I mean, she's got 3 blinks and a recall. She just dodges it constantly. There's no way to trap her, right? And back then, D.Va had 4 seconds of defense matrix to be able to always eat it. Now that doesn't exist. Now it's so inefficient to eat Halt with D.Va that that's not really even why you would pick her. D.Va does look playable in a few instances, and the beautiful thing of all of this is that no comp looks like it's unredeemable at this point. Once the win conditions are figured out and teams know, oh, they're running that, well, we'll just change our focus fire target or our playstyle or whatever. That's how Overwatch always gets adapted, and we find ourselves playing the same 6 heroes at the top level once it gets solved like that. But at least for now, it's chaotic enough where a lot of these different heroes looks like you could justify an argument for as long as the enemy is running certain things that you could counter. D.Va, for example, hardcore counters Roadhog, which is why I'd say he maybe is the weakest in the tank category, which is odd because you'd think with so little barriers in his way that he could carry. But the thing is, all the other tanks are so effective at fighting anyway, especially with recent buffs, that it's hard for me to justify saying you ever really need a hog, especially with D.Va being better. It's possible for Winston D.Va to beat Hog, which you might think isn't supposed to be a thing, but because D.Va can mask her teammates with Defense Matrix, if he doesn't get value with Hook, everything else is just good enough at fighting and also provides support to the team. So I think Hog kind of gets left in the dust. I also would say Zarya probably is like that a bit too, where I don't get the point of Graviton when Orisa has a mini grav on cooldown, much more durable, fortifies on a shorter cooldown than Personal Bubble. So Zarya can do more damage than Orisa, but I think the prevailing thought process is she's just not really required at any point, whereas Orisa has more outplay potential with other things. Keep in mind, Fortify beats May Freeze, which is one of the strongest things in the game right now. Zarya bubbles kind of do that as well. The good news for Zarya players, though, I think in ranked, Zarya might look better when there isn't as much teamwork, but at the higher levels, Halt just has so much potential to combo with a teammate to confirm a kill that I don't think you need the extra damage from Zarya to succeed. You would just use Halt every time, which is kind of a interesting high-level aspect of games anyway, where if something can be done with a bit of communication to get more value, the thing that works for solo play doesn't become relevant, but that's a bit more of a high-level thing. The one hero that feels like he's fallen off the face of the map has been Sigma, and I don't know where I stand on this yet. Now, Sigma has been run on any map that you would consider more of a sniper playground. So we're talking about Junkertown, Havana, these really long line-of-sight payload maps. You can run Sigma because he puts out a shield into the distance, and snipers aren't very good at breaking shields, at least not quickly anyway. He does range damage, has this big ultimate, and he might win sort of just by default because his play style fits on a more long-range type map. But if it gets into medium range engagements, the thing that you find is that Roadhog's damage capability to be able to poke him down really pressures him down quick. Now, in these pugs, the players are really reluctant to pick Sigma, and he kind of just gets poked down and forced out. But I think once the game gets solved a little bit and Sigma play gets more disciplined, his potential is still incredibly high, and I still think he might get played, especially when you factor in the barrier blocks off May Freeze. Kinetic Grasp saves him from Reaper and Reaper's ult, can also eat May Blizzard, and he has a ton of damage. His damage is just incredible. Anytime the team runs D.Va, I think Sigma can counter her, but I will say whenever the enemy runs Winston Ball, Sigma or Orisa pretty much just gets run over instantly. They're just too immobile, and they don't have the benefit of that crazy healing I talked about earlier that can bail them out of just face tanking things that they probably shouldn't. Fortify does that, but Sigma's kind of exploitable, so we'll see where he lands. I think his skill cap is just so high, though, and a lot of times when I see Roadhog get picked, and if he doesn't get instant value, I'm sort of thinking, would it just be better to have a better ultimate and better cooldowns, even if he's harder to play? I think Sigma still is kind of a better Roadhog, essentially what I'm trying to say. So on some defensive maps, especially if you're on high ground and safe, I think there's positions where Sig or Orisa will still be playable. Now, with all of the tanks spoken for, there's been a lot of DPS getting tested out to play inside these team comps, but a concern for me is that because these pugs are a bit more for fun and not really trying to break the game necessarily, I'm a bit concerned that the wide array of DPS picks that we've seen aren't going to really be top meta viable, but let's discuss. So kind of a fun one that players have been trying out is Soldier. And why would that be? Well, Soldier is mobile enough to get off angles on the enemy and sort of flank a little bit. And when they don't have a ton of barriers, he puts out a great volume of damage because he shoots so much before he has to reload. That 20 damage pounding into the enemy team starts to look a lot better when the enemy has less barriers, because this is how that ended up working out. If the enemy had incredible barriers that you couldn't break and you wanted to play a range damage hero, I mean, ultimately they didn't, they played brawler heroes, but stay with me. If you had to flank the barrier as a range damage hero and you couldn't break it, you might as well have played a one-hit kill sniper because you had such a small window to shoot anything meaningful. Well, now when barriers are weaker, there's more wide open gaps where you just have a shooting gallery in front of you, so therefore pressure damage can see a lot more value. Also, just like Winston, Soldier can pressure something down, and with less healing in the game, it's harder to keep that thing alive. Ultimately, though, I don't think Soldier's coming back. It's just sort of an interesting wrinkle and something to keep in mind that in this new landscape, a lot of heroes, whether from tank or any category really, look more playable than before, just because there isn't as much insane defense against everything as there was in the past few patches, with barriers being strong and a extreme high point with the amount of healing that existed. So in ranked, Soldier's probably more playable, but even so, at the highest levels, they're still going to play one-shot kill characters, I think, because they just instantly punish you. Especially Widow can do it at super long range. So if anything is getting played, I still think it would be snipers from range. But other picks that have been coming out, we've seen a lot of Genji, and we'll have to file this away at the also overrated category. Now, the good thing is, because Ana looks a bit better, Genji has something to do when he pulls out Nano Blade. So if you're an incredibly skilled Genji player, that play is still available to you. But outside of that, I think Genji is just too hard to play, and there's too many easy things that exist that get much more free value. I mean, why do you need a Nano Blade, which is incredibly skillful to use, when you can just halt into Blizzard, for example, and play a character that doesn't die rather than one that easily gets focused down? Seeing a lot of Genji in the pugs has been fun to watch, but I'm not buying it that it's going to be a top meta pick, because just like with some of the fun tank combinations that you might want to see, we're just going to keep coming back to the problem that Mei and Reaper are the destroyer of worlds, breaker of metas. They have the best durability cooldowns. They destroy half the tanks in the game still. And the only question or pressure point where you might start to wonder if this isn't the case is, does range damage beat them? Very interesting, because now that there's less shielding in the game, these close range brawl characters have less protection from range damage, focusing them down. So to some degree, if you're playing your Pharmacy or Hanzo especially, and it's harder to protect from these range damage angles, especially in ranked where the pathing and teamwork isn't good enough, they will look very good. I think at the highest level though, the pathing just sort of gets figured out, where it's like, oh, you have a range damage character? Well, we'll just not peek and just play the same GOATS principles we've learned from the past year of using cover and pathing as a team, and only engaging in spots that is good for us. A lot of people get annoyed when I bring up goats again. I'm not really sure why. If it looks like a barnyard animal, smells like a barnyard animal, what do you want me to call it? Oh, it's sheep comp, I guess. You want to call it chicken comp? Whatever, it just brawls on the objective and wins with sustain. The principles are the same. We've been playing the same type of meta even after 2.2.2, just with different heroes, but the principles remain. Until Blizzard actually nerf some of these things that just win with stats, I don't see why it wouldn't be the top still. It's good that they did something like that to Moira. That's a good first step. Now we got to ask ourselves, does Reaper need 40% lifesteal or whatever it is right now? Does Mei need to multi-freeze and have no ranged fall off and have this insane ult and have an escape, which is incredibly important? Oh, we haven't even spoke about Mei wall yet. So because of these things, I don't think we're at the promised land, and I think you'll also find Winston kind of becomes unplayable once those DPS get picked. Reinhardt is kind of durable to it because of the new armor buff, but I somewhat wonder if we'll just see Sigma come back because he actually can outdamage them at range and duel a Reaper head on, or at least attempt to, and he's the only tank that can kind of say that for himself besides maybe Orisa. The only aspect of this that might make me change my mind is that, well, you can't dive onto Mei Reaper, obviously, right? So maybe you could dive the backline, but that brings me to the support category in what characters are actually going to get played. Well, we've seen a combo of things. Mercy Ana is a mainstay, especially when you're playing a lot of these damage characters that either can use nano or use a pocket. Those are incredibly strong, but still a chance that the brawler playstyle with Lucio Moira is still just the best because Moira can escape. Something to note, however, characters like Brigitte and Lucio are massively nerfed in their matchup against Reinhardt. Their crowd control does nothing against him, so as soon as he gets near them, they're going to die. Brig is stronger, however, against dive because her mid-fight armor is better. Her rally also is better. So byproduct of that, Tracer looks basically unplayable against Brig, and the damage focus fire of dive tanks is way weaker against armor, so Brig could counter that. I just don't even think you'll need to do that if you already have Mei and Reaper. But if you wanted to play something other than that, Brig definitely could force them off dive if played correctly. Last few heroes I wanted to mention before I forget. Baptiste and Zenyatta look playable on defense when you establish the high ground, but I think in a lot of cases, Lucio Moira still applies to a lot of Overwatch team fights, and Ana Mercy probably has the highest peak impact of the support category potentially, with the huge plays that Ana's cooldowns or res can have. As well, remember, the damage amps of things like Nano or Mercy's Beam, with Moira's healing being weaker, the breakpoints of some of these damage interactions becomes meaningful again. There's some things that you could be damage amping, like let's say Pharah, for example, shooting down at something and Moira could heal it from a safe corner. Well, now it's possible for those damage numbers to outweigh the healing that Moira can do. That's incredibly important and is an example of another type of thing that is just making the game more playable. The one downside that you might say, though, with a lot of these things changing, is that the ease of use of a lot of things has been opened wide up. And I think especially the average player of Overwatch is going to be shocked at how much more punishing the game is, where you may have used to being able to stand behind a barrier forever and not really have to make a decision on your positioning, getting to cover, taking space, things like that. Well, guys, that's gonna be everything for today's video, discussing this crazy new patch and the observations we've had thus far. At the very least, I think it should produce a much more fun ranked experience, which is all that really matters at the end of the day. So I'll be excited to see it come, and you should expect it probably next week, Tuesday, I'd imagine. That'd be 2 weeks of it existing on the PTR. I'm excited to jump in. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out, lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and be sure to hit the bell icon so that you actually get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.